All right, good to see everybody here tonight, and welcome once again to our World War II lecture series. This is your community lecture series, and we're really proud of the fact that the Muskegon Community College is able to partner with the LST Veterans Museum as well as the Silversides to bring you this type of programming, and just very joyed that we've got a full house here tonight, so welcome aboard. Thank you to this evening's sponsor, and our sponsors really is what helps make this particular lecture series work. Bill Seifert with Eagle Technologies, thank you very much for stepping forth, sponsoring this for us, and we still have a few sponsorships left. If anyone is interested in that, please see Dr. Frank Marzak. Tonight we're going to talk about island hopping, a deadly battle for the Japanese homeland. Students, this is particularly a challenge for you guys. You're used to learning history in a linear fashion. Well, we're stepping out of that fashion tonight. When we look at the battle in the Pacific, it starts, of course, with Pearl Harbor and Midway. And that's number 1 and 2 up here on the screen. We're going to talk about that next week. So we've taken this a bit out of order, and we've done this to accommodate the wonderful guest speakers that we have. So tonight we're going to learn the stories of Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima. Operation Watchtower. Relatively early in the Pacific battle, the Allies are just beginning to push back. We've tasted success at Midway, but by no means are we confident that the Japanese Empire is retreating. 2 strategies. Where do you go? Admiral Nimitz battles with this in Pearl Harbor. Do you go north along the Aleutians, or do you go south through the Solomon Islands with your ultimate goal, of course, being the Japanese homeland? And thus the southern route was selected, taking the supply bases and developing a supply base from Pearl Harbor into the Japanese homeland. So Guadalcanal is going to be interesting because this is really the first time that the Japanese expansion is going to be reversed and set back. The entire Battle of the Pacific is a battle of resources, resource competition. Remember, the Allies, they're deeply committed to the war in Germany. And thus, there's going to be a continual competition for resources throughout the next 3 years, both in men as well as in armaments. So these troops at Guadalcanal, they were raw, right out of basic training. A mere 60 days of supplies arrived with them, not the standard 90 days. The 1st Marines, they dubbed this quite accurately Operation Shoestring. Keep in mind for this week and next week this never-ending resource competition between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Oh, but Guadalcanal was a Pacific paradise. No, not exactly. A mere 14 days of food landed on the island, and thus the soldiers and sailors were immediately cut to 2 rations a day. As so adeptly put by the Marines, the only place on earth where you could stand knee-deep in mud and still get dust in your eyes. The conditions really mark this particular battle. Our pilots, our mechanics, they were living on mud-floored tents in a place called Mosquito Grove. And when you start to do the threat assessments looking at the enemy, Mosquito Grove would be very, very relevant. This is some of the pictorials that the Center for Disease Control put out. Look at that calendar of May 1945. The idea of using your mosquito spray at night and in the morning. Do not go swimming after dusk, because that's when mosquitoes are out the heaviest. And if you don't care about yourself, do it for her back home. Don't go to bed with a malaria mosquito. And malaria is a disease that was pretty much eradicated in the U.S. by this time. By the 1930s, we'd really gotten rid of about 95% of our malaria. So thus, our soldiers were not used to this. They did not have natural immunities, and the mosquitoes were a very, very serious threat. Enemies of them both, the Japanese and the mosquitoes, eliminate them both in a very pointed sign for those who did not take their mosquito medicine. So really looking at the conditions of this battle for young men 18, 19, 20 years old. Iwo Jima, Operation Detachment. This would take place 2 years later. Now we're at the end of the war. Confidence is high. The idea of defeating the Japanese, it's not if, it's when. And that's going to be very, very soon. And that probably led to a little bit of overconfidence that Iwo Jima would fall in 1 week. We really were not aware of the incredible defenses that the Japanese had on the island. Intricate tunnels connecting the various pillbox, landmines, camouflage machine guns, snipers, all on a volcanic piece of rock. And this 1 week falling date certainly was overly optimistic. Terrible weapons. By late in the war, terrible weapons would become indeed the weapons of choice. Perhaps the most terrible weapons from the Allied side was the relentless kamikaze attacks. 318 soldiers would be killed on Iwo Jima by kamikaze attacks. The kamikaze attacks were actually prevalent throughout the war. Early in the war, various defensive strategies were developed, and number one was the thatch weave pattern. Flying in that pattern that I've got shown up there would prevent or at least mitigate the idea of being struck by kamikaze in midair. The enhanced radar. The difference in radar from the 1940s, early 1940, when the British were standing alone against Adolf Hitler, to the end of the war was just tremendous increase in technology, and the radar was so much better. In addition, the British sea crafts were flying so high, effective they could not be struck by the kamikazes. But probably more than anything was the Allied troops and pilots that were trained. This late in the war, Japan is really putting out just the youngest of boys with the minimum of training. And our pilots are very seasoned, very skilled, and that more than anything probably mitigated these kamikaze attacks. Banzai. Effectual human waves of suicide attacks. And while the effective rate was not overly effective, it really was a tremendous blow for American morale to have to effectively mow down Japanese men charging with Civil War tactics of 3 generations previously. And thus on Guadalcanal, 800 Japanese would launch a direct attack on Henderson Field. It'd be unsuccessful. The M2 flamethrower, another horrible weapon. 100-yard range, 150-second firing time, certainly destroying anything in its path. Also, no small feat for the soldier wearing 70 pounds of compressed fuel. Even the slightest shrapnel would meet a surely end there. So we look at these terrible weapons, and perhaps all weapons are terrible, but certainly this late in the war with Iwo Jima, we're witnessing terrible weapons. And of course, as we know, only 4 months later would become the most horrible weapons of them all. So when we listen to our speakers tonight, we want to think about the Battle of Guadalcanal as the first battle really challenging supremacy of the Japanese forces. As while we were successful at Midway, was that a one-time success or has the tide turned? And we get to Iwo Jima. This is a volcanic piece of rock that we'll learn really, while it was set up as an easy launching path, was anything but easy. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker tonight. Our first speaker tonight was a member of the famed 82nd Airborne Unit. He had his education at Purdue University, Harvard University, and the American Military University. Mr. Weikel spent years as an engineer for GE. He retired and has then really dedicated his life to being a huge part of this community with the LST Veterans Museum. It's located right downtown, and one of our partners. Dan has been instrumental in bringing us this lecture series and just underscores the partnership between these fine two museums and the college. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Weikel.
First off, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know all you veterans out there. I salute you. I really do. It's amazing what you have done and what you stand for. I might add right away, you students, boy, you have a big responsibility. Over the years at the Veterans Museum, I've really been kind of disappointed at the young people that come on board the ship. They're just astounded what they see there, but they're astounded when they hear the stories of what happened back in World War II and some of the other wars too. They don't get that education, and it's so important that what you did and your comrades did is not forgotten. And we're not going to be here much longer, but you students will be, and it's your responsibility, I believe, to carry this word that you hear in all these lectures. So anyway, I put on everybody's chair kind of some detail about Guadalcanal. Nothing to follow, nothing to read now, but especially after what Kurt just said, he took about 3/4 of what I was going to say so I can get done early. I had no idea he was going to cover that much. But anyway, there is a lot of detail in there, and what Kurt said and the slides that I will show you, there's a lot of detail behind each one of those statements and each one of those words, and perhaps later when you look through that you can find some meaning and some detail to some of those concepts, words, battles, and so on. That's all that's meant to be. It's not meant for you to necessarily follow tonight. I call this land landing force. That's what the Navy said on the night of the 6th or 7th of August. Land landing force, and that was the first time in World War II that was heard, especially in the Pacific, as we'll see. A little background. Kurt's covered most of it. I'll get it quickly. What I was going to say, Guadalcanal, while it was successful, had a lot of problems. Communications, getting stuff from ship to shore. What do you do with it when you get it on the shore? There were a lot of problems, and we've all heard of them, we know of them, but we have to recognize they were there. And perhaps because the Japanese ran when the Marines landed at Guadalcanal, it wasn't the same way at Gattuva, but it was at Guadalcanal, we might have had a hard time staying on that island. So we had some problems. And I like to think that even though we had those problems, we had the ability or the knowledge to go ahead and make that landing. And that always made me think, how in the world did we have the knowledge? How did we know what to do? Well, we say we knew we had to invade, but there has to be more to it than that. I like to talk about quickly the doctrine of amphibious warfare as developed by the United States. It's an amazing story. And if you really look at it, it's not a dull story. It's a very amazing, a wonderful story. And I mention it briefly here and say that by 1900, the United States realized that all the island nations we had friended, as we approached more wars and closer to war and closer to war, defending those islands was not really where we were going to be. We weren't going to be there. We weren't on the islands. We weren't defending them. We weren't going to defend them. It just kind of hit us that that's our thinking was wrong in terms of occupying and then defending. We had to take those islands. We had to invade those islands. It finally hit this country back in the early 1900s that we had to do that. Well, the question, of course, was how do we do that? And I had a man named Harold Elliott. He came up with the idea that we better do something because eventually we're going to go over to Japan. And this was way back in 1900. So early then, we had to start thinking about what a doctrine would be. How do we go to war? And where are we going to war? So back in 1900, the Navy actually formed an organization called the General Board of the Navy, still exists today. And the General Board started talking about those things. Things had really changed after 1900, before 1900. A lot more equipment, better weapons, better training. Things just weren't the same, so the Navy formed this board to talk about and to develop a doctrine. How are we going to put all this together? So they came up with the Marine Advanced Force. They realized that this idea of invading, and invading rather than defending all the time, was really going to happen. So they formed this Marine Advanced Force, and they took the Marines, a group of them, set up a headquarters, and they began to investigate. What will it take? This was the Advanced Marine Force. Well, in 1930, they came up with what was called the Fleet Marine Force. And this was a combination of the Navy and the Marines. And while the Marines were always connected with the Navy, perhaps, this was the first time that it was realized that if we're going to go into this invasion mode, we have to have the Marines exclusively working for the Navy. And this was, of course, realized for a long time. It really happened in the 30s, and they came up with, this group, the Fleet Marine Force, came up with a manual called the Tentative Landing Operations Manual. The Tentative Landing Operations Manual. It's a book, a pamphlet, whatever, call it what you want. But it describes what happens when you invade something. And in this case, the theory was it was going to invading the islands of the Pacific. And of course, they were right. This was a marvelous piece of work. It laid down what it was then the basis for invading an island, landing on an island, and it still is today. Of course, it changes all the time with new equipment, new technology. I just put this up here, certainly not to read it, but this is the landing operations doctrine in 1938, which is right before World War II. I just wanted you to get a concept or a feel for how complex this thing is. It contains, I'm not going to read it, but I want to at least get a couple of these things. Chapter 1 is landing operations. This is where the planning goes in. Who are we going to invade? When are we going to invade? It's not haphazard process. We really got to study that. Well, it describes those things. The task organizations. What happens on the beach? Once we unload the ships, once the stuff gets to the beach, what happens to it? You think about that. Thousands of men, tons of equipment. When it gets to the beach, what are we going to do with it? This was the first document that started to detail the kind of boats, the kinds of ships that were required to get the troops to the beach and to get the material from the ships onto the beach. Once we get to the beach, then how do we get the supplies from ship to shore? What types and quantity of naval gunfire is needed? All my life, when I read about these battles, I learn of the naval gunfire, not haphazard, of course, but how do they know what kind of shells to use? How big of a shell? How far out can the ships be? What's the target's going to be? Well, that's all got to be spelled out before an invasion. Amazing, this book covers it. Same way with air cover. What's available? The Air Force doesn't show up. They have to research what carriers, what bases, what planes are available. That's all part of what happens through this doctrine. Communications, terrible communications at the start of Guadalcanal, and we suffered for it. But the doctrine in this book, it's still there. Artillery and armaments report, what's on land, what are the troops going to need? All that's spelled out in this marvelous document. So, and the last thing, what logistical support is needed. Food, medicine, those kinds of things. What's needed, and where does that come into the scheme of things as far as landing it? One of the biggest problems, perhaps, on several of the island invasions, the order in which a ship is loaded. You're not going to put the medical supplies first and way in the back put the ammunition. It's got to kind of be the other way around. So even those kinds of things are detailed and explained in a doctrine as laid down by this marvelous book. But it was all theory, had to be tested. So at that point, something called Flex was created. And Flex was an exercise that occurred in Cuba every year from 1935 until the invasion we're talking about, Guadalcanal. The Marines, by this doctrine, would land in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, and they would practice war. So we got a little bit of experience, but the next one was going to be real, obviously. Okay, so I'd like to mention that this doctrine back in 42, we didn't have LSTs, we didn't have a lot of the ships we had later in the war. So we had to use transports. This was a common way to get things to a beach, to Guadalcanal. Again, no LSTs. And over the sides with equipment, over the sides with men, into Higgins boats, or into ATVs. ATV-1 was a real workhorse at Guadalcanal. And just for anybody who doesn't recognize the Higgins boat or the ATV, the tractor, the treaded tractor, very common at Guadalcanal. Okay, so once we had doctrine laid down, no matter how good it was, we decided that we were ready to go to war, and for the reasons Kurt mentioned, Guadalcanal was selected. This kind of defines the sphere of influence the Japanese had in the Pacific. Down here at the bottom we see Guadalcanal, and you kind of get a perspective of the entire Pacific area. Oh, that's right on the very edge of that arrow. Well, that's where we started, obviously. The bottom rung of the ladder on its way up to Japan itself. As I say there, the Japanese had expanded as far as the Aleutians. By this time they had landed in the Aleutians. They were south to New Guinea, and they were east of Guadalcanal, almost all the way to Midway, were in their sphere of influence. So the U.S. recognized that further expansion would be a real threat to the transport of troops and material to Argentina, to New Zealand, and vice versa going the other way. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff finally realized we had to do something, and hence we have Guadalcanal. It's interesting to note that the first time the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to act, Guadalcanal was not in the plan, just the islands to the north. And supposedly a B-17 bomber flying over Guadalcanal looked down one day and said, "Oh, there's an airfield down there." And it was the first time we were sure. The coast watchers, the natives, had made us sink it, but the B-17 spotted it, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff changed then from just Catuvo, Tanambogo, to include now Guadalcanal. MacArthur and Nimitz deserve almost a moment of silence. They didn't like each other. We probably know that as well as I do. The Joint Chiefs, they placed the South Pacific under MacArthur. And we'll look at what that meant by the South Pacific area in a minute. But it included Guadalcanal. So naturally, you would think that why did MacArthur not direct things at Guadalcanal then? Both MacArthur and Nimitz agreed the threat to Australia was real, therefore something had to be done. And they also agreed that until the whole program was completed, the Japanese base at Rabaul had to be neutralized. Big base, deep water port, a lot of troops, a lot of naval aircraft. It was really a center of activity, war activity for the Japanese. So they both agreed Rabaul had to be neutralized. And MacArthur wanted a direct assault on Rabaul rather than going to Guadalcanal. He wanted three of Fletcher's carriers, two of Nimitz's carriers, and he wanted the 1st Marine Division, and he wanted to direct that invasion and capture of Rabaul. Nimitz about had a heart attack, they say. He said, no way am I giving up 2 carriers in the 1st Marine Division to MacArthur. So there's kind of a stalemate that had to be settled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they elected that Nimitz would have the authority, would get the order to invade Guadalcanal and not MacArthur. So all of a sudden, a little bit of MacArthur's area slipped into Nimitz's area for this invasion. Just to clear up perhaps the area, the big area in the blue square was Nimitz's area of responsibility, and then the little rectangle to the bottom right, that was part of Nimitz's command too. He directed, or he put Gormley, I believe his name was. It was assigned to him, but you see right at that bottom, right here's Guadalcanal. The division between the two became Nimitz's instead of MacArthur's. Up here by the wall, as you'll see, is Rabaul is up here where MacArthur wanted to go. Okay, there you see where Rabaul would have been located. And in this area that Gormley now took over was the area that had Guadalcanal in it. It kind of shows you the relationship of the areas of command between Nimitz and MacArthur. The 1st Marine Division was selected for this battle. They were the only ones that had been trained, had been through the last flex operations. Part of them were in New Zealand already, part of them were in the States, part of them were in New Caledonia, and part of them were in Hawaii. So they had to kind of gather all these guys together, all these troops together, outfit them, do any final training they had to do, and get them ready for this invasion. A big, big task. The 1st Marine Division, as we said, is the one that was selected. This is their patch that we happen to have on the LST, by the way, a real one. Vandergrift was their commander. This picture, I think, is an outstanding picture. The man, he doesn't look mean, but he sure looks firm. He was a very good commander, as we think today. But he had 30 days to get ready. When they gave him the order to go, he had 30 days. Equally challenging, I believe, to getting all the troops together was getting the transports loaded and ready for invasion. Remember now, these are not LSTs or things like that you can drive into. These are transports. And the transport carried the goods of war to New Zealand, to the docks, and they had to be unloaded. Then they had to be reloaded with the items that were critical first, would go in last. Each transport had to have certain kind of equipment on it, but it didn't come to New Zealand that way, so it had to be changed back and forth. Quite a task to do in just 30 days. Well, when the ships got to New Zealand, they ran into union problems. They really did. It was rainy, it was a rainy season. Everything was packed in cardboard. The rain just melted the cardboard when they brought it off the ships. It was a mess. They said that cardboard cases of cornflakes that were in cardboard, they were walking knee deep and or ankle deep in wet cornflakes, mushy chocolate bars, Hershey bars. It was really a mess. And the union said, we want special pay, extra pay for handling that. And Vandegrift, of course, said no, kicked the union people, the longshoremen off the dock in essence, and brought in U.S. Marines who took over. I found one report that said the Marines freely went to all the walls of the building, the sides of the docks, and they put some very profane graffiti all over the buildings and docks of New Zealand, telling the longshoremen what they thought of it. Good old Marines. So anyway, it was a real problem. Now, once I think Kurt mentioned too, they had only 60 days of rations and supplies on those transports that came to New Zealand. Well, things got slowed down by the rain. It didn't look like we were going to make it, so they actually cut the supplies from 60 days to 30 days. They left many of the trucks and tractors in New Zealand. They never made it to Guadalcanal in the initial push. And the ammunition, they had 30 days delivered to New Zealand. They end up packing 10 days worth of ammunition for this invasion force. So it's real problems from the very beginning. And like I said, everything packed in rain, it just kind of turned to mush. But anyway, in spite of the problems, within the 30 days, they were ready to go with 30 days of supplies, not what they thought they'd have, but they were ready. Notice that up at the top is the Florida Islands, and the larger island, of course, is Guadalcanal. Well, on the night of the 6th, we had a task force called X-Ray and a task force called Yoke and X-Ray. Task Force Yoke was the task force that went to Katuvo, and the task force X-Ray carried the troops who were actually going to Guadalcanal. That's how they approached from that direction. We'll look at this again a little bit later with some other stuff on it. But it at least shows that the task force is kind of split in that area. The number 2, this is it indicates the landing of the Marines at close to the airfield. And on August 8th, Henderson Field, I don't need to dwell on it, but the airport or the airfield that was being built by the Japanese, finally on August 8th, it was finally taken by the Marines. On August 21st, again, I'm not going to talk about a lot of detail about the various attacks, but like Kurt said, so many attacks in the course of that campaign were the hordes and waves of Jap after Jap. Well, on the night of the 20th, 21st of August was Ichiki's turn to attack the Marines, wave after wave. He was killed, and some 700 Japanese were also killed that night. On the 7th of September, we get up to, by that time, the Marines sent a raiding party up to Tavu. That was right at the end of August. And by the 12th and 14th of September, Kawaguchi, who was now on Guadalcanal, hadn't been there originally, he attacked the Marines. I think Edson's Ridge came in here. He thought that he had intelligence that said that the Marines had about 2,000 troops there, where actually they had closer to 7,000 troops, and they were waiting for the Japanese. And another one of those horrible battles where wave after wave of Japanese were killed at Edson's Ridge. In October, by October, Japanese were able to land some reserves in that area. And by the 23rd, 26th of October, at this river, probably the last mass wave of Japanese attack and another one of those horrible slaughters occurred. But then by the January, the Japanese were admitting that they were defeated. So by the middle of January, they started to withdraw, and then I'm just saying by the end of January, first part of February, they made their last withdrawals. My purpose, I'm not trying to tell you everything that happened at every battle. I just hope that gives you kind of a clue as to how the campaign went once the Marines had landed. There were several sea battles at Guadalcanal during the campaign. Listed here are 5 of them that are considered the major battles around Guadalcanal, sea battles, and perhaps they were. And we'll talk about or mention them plus a few others. The first one was the Battle of Savo Island, and that was the night of the 8th and 9th of August. Excuse me. And it was a battle that was terrible from the very beginning. Communications between ships were very poor. The American commanders on those ships were afraid to shoot for fear they would hit one of their own ships. They mistook ships they thought they saw for the enemy, but they were friendly, or they thought they were friendly and they were enemy. It was just a terrible, terrible screw-up on the part of the Americans. There were 1,077 Allied sailors killed that night. It was the worst defeat the U.S. Navy ever had in one battle. The worst defeat ever. And some people have already asked me, well, how about Pearl Harbor? Well, that was peacetime. This was wartime. It's the worst defeat in U.S. Navy in peacetime, or excuse me, during the war. The sailors, after the battle, they gave it a nickname, the Battle of the 5 Sitting Ducks. There were 5 ships that went down that night. There were 3 cruisers, 4 cruisers, and 2 destroyers that were sunk that night, again with a loss of life of over 1,000. The cruiser San Francisco was one of those ships, and the captain, whose name was Bode, B-O-D-E, very sad story with him. After an investigation was convened by the Navy as to why we did so bad in that battle, he was the only man who was ever put up on charges or held responsible. His name was Bode. He took it so hard that on April 19th, after he had been removed from the battle, he committed suicide in his office. That's how hard he took it, so to speak. So anyway, the terrible battle that was. On the 24th and 25th of August, and that's not up there, was the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. It was considered a draw, but it was the last time that the Japanese decided to send transports with reinforcements to Guadalcanal. They continued sending reinforcements and supplies, but now they're coming by destroyer or by submarine. Open transport, that was the last time. So there, middle to the end of August, the Japanese gave up trying to get transports through. So maybe the U.S. won that one because of that. San Cristobal Island. Let's see, what's the next? Let's see. No, I don't have that one up there either. Another one. I only put up the ones that were considered major, but the others were important. San Cristobal Island would be to the bottom right of that map. That's where San Cristobal was, or is. And there was a battle there that's considered part of the total campaign. The thing significant is that was America's first and worst, I'm sorry, it was their worst, not the first, but the worst experience they had with a Japanese torpedo. The Japanese had developed a torpedo that would not go down to the bottom. They could set it to be deep, or they could set it to be right under the surface, and the range was phenomenal compared to the torpedoes we had. Well, that night on the 15th of September, the destroyers, not submarines, but destroyers in the Japanese force laid down so many torpedoes that the Americans were sure that they were being attacked that night by submarines. Well, the net outcome of that, the worst outcome, was that the Hornet, the aircraft carrier Hornet, you might remember, it was hit by 6 of those torpedoes. And while it didn't sink that night, the next day the U.S. destroyer Lansdowne had to scuttle it, had to fire torpedoes of their own to sink it. It was that badly damaged. So we lost the Hornet at San Cristobal, the Battle of. Then came the Battle of Cape Esperance. That was, I think, yeah, I do have that. That was up by Savo Island on the 11th of October. The U.S. lost one destroyer in that battle. The Japanese lost a cruiser and three destroyers. And that was pretty much considered another draw, U.S.-Japanese. We actually lost less hardware, but they were able to get their troops off their destroyers that night and get them onto Guadalcanal. The next battle was the Battle of Santa Cruz Island. That was the 25th and 7th of October. And I mentioned this one because while it was Santa Cruz Island, it was quite a ways away. We lost the Wasp, the aircraft carrier Wasp that night. So now we had lost 2 aircraft carriers. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the Sea Battle of Guadalcanal, it's considered there were 2 of them. On the 12th and 13th of November, the next night was the second battle. It's recognized as a second battle, but there was just one night, then the next night. But that was a terrible battle, a terrible loss too. The Japanese lost 2 battleships. We lost several cruisers. We lost destroyers. We had 1,732 sailors killed in those 2 nights. The Japanese had 1,900 killed. It was the second battle, the second night. It was a battle of battleship against battleship. And there were only 2 of them in World War II, where battleship fired almost point blank at other battleships. The other one was in Leyte Gulf in the Philippine campaign. So that was another terrible night that I like to mention so we never forget that. On 30th of November, at Tesafrangra, the U.S. planned an ambush. They knew the Japanese were coming because of coast watchers and because of other intelligence. So we laid in wait for them, but it was not successful. The ambush failed, and it became the 3rd largest U.S. loss in naval history. And again, it was because of torpedoes fired by destroyers. And for months afterwards, the Navy claimed, we were attacked by submarines, but it was destroyers with torpedoes. And finally, to end this line, the last battle that was considered part of the Guadalcanal campaign was the Battle of Rennell Island. Renault Islands, which is again is south and east of Guadalcanal. There are 31. It was 31 Japanese Mitsubishi's 3Gs, which are twin-engine bombers. 31 of them, and they sank 3 American ships. They lost 12 of the airplanes, but it was another terrible loss for the Americans. So, again, I hate to dwell on that or bore you with all that, but it's also important that we understand what these guys went through. Not just the Marines on land, but the Navy really took it on the chin at Guadalcanal. There we see the first battle of Guadalcanal. Whoops. There we go. During the entire campaign, the Japanese committed 36,000 troops. 31,000 were killed. Terrible, terrible odds for the Japanese. Only 1,000 were captured, so if you take 31 and 1,000 is 32, that means that only 4,000 Japanese got off that island alive. Terrible loss for them. As I said, 42, right at 4,000 were evacuated. In addition to that, we lost 29 ships and 615 aircraft during the battle for Guadalcanal. The Japanese lost 38 ships and 880 aircraft. Terrible loss of material. I asked that question, what's the major significance of these losses? Besides the physical loss, what meaning does this have to it? What did we really learn from this? Well, I like to ask it that way. But the importance here is that while we lost about the same equipment, the difference is in the United States, we were continually building more. We had geared up and we were building stuff at such a rate that we could replace every ship and we could replace every aircraft that we lost. And we could fill in or push in a new pilot or a new navigator or a new gunner, a new ship captain. Anything we needed, we could replace because we were training sailors, Marines, and Army troops that fast. The Japanese didn't have that ability. So every time they lost planes or people, their ability to replace them was less and less and less. So this was really the important part here, I think, of mentioning all of this. It shows that that was true. Was it worth it? We know it halted the further expansion of the so-called Greater Asia, East Asia co-conspiracy ring, that's what the Japanese called it. It placed us, obviously, in a position of naval supremacy. It eliminated the major threat that we were afraid of the shipping routes to and from Australia and New Zealand. Very important. It was the first rung in the ladder that we called the ladder, hopping up until to Japan itself. And perhaps as important as the military victory, what I just said. Plus, the United States on a level playing field, man against man, we had proven that we could stand up to the Japanese that had this mystique about them being night fighters, willing to die for the country, which they did. But we could stand up to that and we could win. And the psychological boost that gave the United States was just, you just couldn't calculate that until it happened. So, very important. Okay, tonight I was scheduled to have with me this gentleman, Warren Moosh. He was a veteran at Guadalcanal, or excuse me, at Iwo Jima. He was he was with the 5th Marine Division, and believe it or not, Warren was 20 feet away from the raising of the flag of Mount Suribachi. He was there, and he was going to tell about some of his experiences. Unfortunately, he won't be here. But in the time I talked to Warren, he said, well, let me give you some slides, or let me give you some information. Maybe you can at least bring it up real quick. And I'm not going to try to go into any detail, but a little bit about Iwo Jima. As Kurt said, it's a small island. It's halfway between Tokyo and the Marianas, and the U.S. looked at it, the Joint Chiefs looked at it as a place to land B-29s that were in trouble, going to and from Japan. This slide gives you a little bit of a overhead diagram of what the island looked like. A little point down at the bottom is Mount Suribachi, and the wider part up at the top, the north end of it, that's where the Japanese made their last stand, the Northern Highlands. There were actually 3 airfields on Iwo Jima. The big one right in toward the center, a little bit north of that, the second one, and the third one was under construction up in the Northern Highlands, in the northern part of the island. That's kind of the layout that the Marines were looking at. It means Sulphur Island. I think we know that. But it's due to the volcanic and the sulfur deposits there. There were civilians there that mined or refined the sulfur, mostly Japanese. When the Japanese moved out, the civilians moved out, replaced strictly by Japanese troops. 3 airfields, as I mentioned, and Kurt mentioned too the tunnels. They honeycombed that island with tunnels. There were 11 miles of tunnels on that tiny island. And the concrete and the reinforcing steel that they used, the sandbags, the timbers that they could find, the reinforcement of these emplacements was phenomenal. And within the tunnels, they had hospitals, mess halls, sleeping quarters, headquarters, communication centers, all underground. None of it seen by the Allies before they invaded. Tadamichi Kurabashi, he went to the island in command, and he accumulated 21,000 troops. The land was fortified with all the things we just mentioned, a lot of arms. 1 minute ahead of schedule, but on the 19th of February, the 3rd and 4th Marines with the 5th Amphibious Division landed on the beach at Iwo Jima. And we know that the Japanese immediately did not open fire. The Marines didn't have a firefight when they first stepped on the beach. The Japanese waited until the beach was full. We talked about a doctrine. The doctrine called for a lot of material to be landed with the invading forces. All that was on the beach, and that's when the Japanese began to fire. I mentioned this man once before. Probably one of the least understood men of the whole war. Anybody recognize him? That's Major General Holland M. Smith. Holland M. Smith. And I mention him again because of the doctrine. He is the man who decided or told, when we invade Iwo Jima, load the ships this way. Put this in first, this in last. You go here, you go here. Amazing that he could have that ability, but he really did that. But he did it with such demanding obedience that the troops called him Holland Mad Smith instead of, Holland M. They refer to him as Hollerin' Mad Smith, and maybe you've seen that. But anyway, he was a savior in many of the islands, coming from Guadalcanal right up through Okinawa. The beaches, we think of the black sand. It was mainly ash from the Mount Suribachi, but it made it very difficult to walk, let alone drive a vehicle through it, or put a tank or a tracked vehicle through it. One Marine called it was like hell with no fire. It was just unbelievable. The American battleships Texas and New York, super fortresses, B-29s. For months, they shelled Iwo Jima. There was no island or no place in World War II that had as long a time on target shelling as what Iwo Jima did. Like 73 days of continued bombing and shelling. But we know now that it didn't do anything to speak of. They were so entrenched in tunnels and reinforced pillboxes that it didn't have much effect. This is another map of Iwo Jima, obviously, and it's pretty easy to decipher or see where the Marines landed. We've already said Kiribati's plan was to wait until the beach got full, then open up, but 30,000 landed. They were under General Smith. They had they had a lot of difficulty because of that deep sand and ash. But as soon as they were on the beach, that's when the Japanese began to open up on them. Heavy losses, we know that. But by nightfall, they had isolated Mount Suribachi, and in 3 more days of fighting, they were finally up the sides of Suribachi. This map, I don't remember whether they put that in the booklet or not, but it shows day by day the efforts of the Marines on Iwo Jima. Bottom left, that little black box, that's day 1. They had come inland, secured the beach, and they were that far, they had just touched the first airport. The second day is that little blue line that goes through the center. They'd gone from one side of the island to the other, advancing north. By day 8, they were up to the second blue line, just past the top of that second airfield. But everything obviously was pushing the Japanese further and further north. And until the 26th, and day 26, they were finally able to push the remaining Japs out of the last of their stronghold, out of the last tunnels. After 26 days, Nimitz declared the island secure. It's interesting to note in the next 2 months, 2,000 more Japanese were killed. It wasn't very secure at all. I think in one of those booklets I passed out, I said that after that date, 2,000 American troops were killed, but that's not true. It was Japanese. A little difference there. But proofreader didn't get that one. So anyway, we are finally pushing them off the north end of the island. I wanted to put this in, not just to show Mount Suribachi, but look at the ships going toward the beach. Compare that to your vision of what Guadalcanal must have been, with transports, helter-skelter, with LCVPs and Amtraks running around trying to get the guys on shore. What a difference the doctrine had grown to by this time. The Navy at the time of Iwo Jima had 5,000 ships, not just there, but the Navy had grown to 5,000 ships. The American people were really doing a job back home. But isn't that amazing? Good views of what the beach looked like. These are real photos. This is what the sand or that ash did to the Marines trying to get material up on the beach, off the beach. Notice the LSTs full of material. Big difference between the two campaigns. Look at the Jeep stuck in that stuff. It's just amazing. No vehicle could get through it. So what the Marines accomplished, it's amazing because they did it hand to hand, so to speak. From Mount Suribachi, looking down at some of the landing ships, the LSTs. Those aren't LSTs, but it shows that continually they had stuff coming on shore. Don't have to mention this. We're so aware of this. The 2 flag raisings. This is the second one. Rosenthal took this photograph. Warren Moose, had he been here, he had some real stories to talk about, because again, he was there 20 feet away from those men when they did that. And he tells us so eloquently. The Northern Plateau, while the capture of Silversides lifted the spirits of the machine, it wasn't even close to being taken by that time. It'd be especially hard to take, they knew, because they now knew about the tunnels, the fortifications, and so on. Flushing out the caves. Kurt mentioned this. Once we realized what we were dealt with, we used the terror weapons, the flamethrowers, tanks, and personal flamethrowers had to be used. I think Kurt might have had that same photograph. But the flamethrowers, I don't have to dwell on it. Kurt did a great job of explaining the terror that they provided. A good photo here of in the middle you can see the gun barrel sticking out with the Marine standing there, and what's left of the bunker. Notice the concrete, the reinforcing steel. Must have been a direct hit by a Navy shell to do that. But it's typical of the defenses that the guys had at Iwo Jima. The tunnels, this is one of the tunnel entrances. The island was studded with them, camouflaged. And once they were found, in go the satchel charges, the explosives, and the flamethrowers. A concrete pillbox, good shot of what the flamethrowers could do to that. So it continued for weeks as the Marines worked their way north. Finally, there were just two pockets of defense of the extreme northern part, and the Japanese that were left, a lot of suicides, a lot of suicide attacks, but on March 23rd it was declared secure. And here's where I put, close to 2,000 more Marines and Army troops died after the campaign was over. That should have been Japanese troops, sorry about that. So Nimitz was just a little bit wrong. 30% of the Marines that landed on Iwo Jima, there were 7,000 killed, 17,000 wounded. Just about all the Japanese were killed, approximately 21,000 with General Kuribashi. And a third, I found it interesting to note that a third of all the Marines killed in World War II were killed on Iwo Jima. That's how severe that was. There were 27 medals of honor, and within a year after this, 2,400 disabled B-29 bombers had landed and found refuge on Iwo Jima, and they estimate some 30,000 American lives were saved therefore. So was it worth it? That's a good question this Marine might ask. Do you think it was worth it? And the only answer is, this is why they did it, because of this B-29. Well, that's all I have. I just tried to touch on a little bit to give you an understanding of how severe the two campaigns were, and a little bit on the doctrine that led up to them, and a comparison between the two. To talk about those two campaigns would take a month, 2 months on each one of them. It's just impossible to cover it all. So if that's, unless you have a question I can answer, I'm through.
Please join me in thanking Dan for his presentation. Again, thank you for your professionalism. Thank you for helping to educate us. We appreciate this material you laid out for us. And students, I know you're going to need to take this. What is the legacy of Iwo Jima? It's been 69 years since the Marines landed on Iwo Jima. Since then, the battle has evolved into a symbol of World War II. The flag raised at Iwo Jima is an American icon. However, Iwo Jima is so much more than a flag pitched in volcanic rock. The island was just a place, but what happened on that place was something special. On a hellish battlefield, young men, under fire, accomplished the impossible. They hammered their bodies against concrete and steel. And against all odds, the concrete and steel gave way. It could not hold back a few good men. When the firefighters raised a flag over the ruins of the World Trade Center after September 11th, a photographer snapped a photo. Almost instantly, that photo was compared to the infamous Iwo Jima flag-raising photo. But the lasting icon of Iwo Jima is not a photograph, but of unknown young Marines from little towns all around this land who found the fortitude to keep fighting. In World War II, uncommon valor was a common virtue. We owe all of our veterans the thanks of a grateful nation. And I know we've got some World War veterans here tonight. Gentlemen from World War II, if you could stand up and be recognized, we'd sure appreciate that. I know there's a handful of you guys tonight. And if all veterans could stand up, we'd like to recognize all veterans from all eras. Thank you very much. Our next speaker was born in California, raised in Southwest Michigan. In 1969, he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve, and during the next 5 years, he rose to the rank of quartermaster second class. After his graduation from Hope College, he reported to his first duty station, the USS John S. McCain. In 1992, Captain Birch took command of the USS Haler. During that tour, the Haler participated in the aftermath of the First Gulf War, boarding ships in the Red Sea and enforcing sanctions against Iraq. He then took command of the Fleet Training Center in Norfolk, Virginia in 1998, and he supervised the education and training of over 35,000 sailors each year. After his retirement from active duty in 2003, he worked as a federal employee with the Sea Warrior Project. In 2008, he left government service to return back home here to Michigan. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Captain Birch. Thank you very much.
I want to say that, first off, I really appreciate the offer to take a chance to talk to you. Because this is a time frame where, as Kurt has said before, that we have a lot of World War II veterans that are certainly getting into their 90s at this point. My father died last October, a year ago last October, and he had a very interesting time during World War II, along with my mother, who was also an active member in World War II. But growing up in Michigan, when I would talk to my father about his experiences, he didn't want to talk about them. He just didn't talk much about them. He would talk about Pearl Harbor, which he was at, but not very much about anything else that he experienced during the war. And it was only about 10 years after I was on active duty in the Navy. I was a lieutenant at the time. I think I was on Comte de Grasse. We were living in Virginia Beach, and he and I were out surf fishing on a weekend. And he started to tell me a story. And he said, you see that reef that's out there, that sandbar that's out on the beach? And it was about maybe 50 yards out from the beach. And he said, off from Saipan on the first day, we were anchored about 25 yards past where that sandbar was. And he said, we were shooting directly across the heads where the Marines had landed in direct naval gunfire support. And at that particular time, they were going back and forth from their naval gunfire support position to get ammo, back in to take their position, shoot at the Japanese as they were massing across coming down onto the beach trying to push the Marines into the water. And they actually did push the Marines into the water at one point. The Marines actually got pushed back and were fighting in waist-deep water as the tides were coming in. And he said they ended up that they originally were shooting solid shot, an explosive shot at the enemy. But then they had an idea that what they would do was to take anti-aircraft shells and shoot those instead. And they could cut the fuses so that they would explode directly over the enemy and only about 10 to 15 yards in front of where the Marines were actually were. So they did that, and they just had massive, as Kurt was talking about, just massive amounts of people that were dead on the beach. And he said that was bad enough. He said, but what then happened was they were off the beach as the Marines started to get farther inland. And he said that evening, I think it was the second day, the evening of the second day, the entire water went calm. And he said what happened was that the tide came up and the bodies started floating out to sea. He said, so they were steaming around off the beach in an ocean just full of dead soldiers and Marines and Japanese and Korean civilians that were on the island in Saipan. And he said they steamed around out there for about 3 or 4 days. And later in that week, as you probably are aware, as they pushed inland on Saipan, instead of surrendering, the Japanese decided to have a mass suicide on the island. And they jumped off from Suicide Cliff. And they not only did that for the men, but they took the women and the children and the Korean workers that were working for them, the slaves that they had taken from Korea, and they forced them to jump as well. And again, the same thing happened, where for about 3 or 4 days, the bodies would come up, and they were floating around, and these folks were out there steaming around through these bodies. That was the first time that he had ever talked about his experiences with me. Pretty strange. But slowly, over the next few years, he would tell me a little bit more. And he would tell other members of our family a little bit more. And we started to talk to him. We said, you know what? You need to take the time to write this stuff down. So he did. So for the last 10 years of his life, he laid out his life, and he decided to tell a story about what happened. And not only what happened during World War II, but what happened before World War II, during World War II, his life as an aviator after he left the surface Navy, and then ultimately when he decided to come back here to Michigan, he ended up being the principal of Holland High School down in Holland, and a businessman around the area, and my mother was a teacher. So today, it's often been said that there's a little bit of a difference between sea stories and fairy tales. Fairy tales start off once upon a time. But sea stories start off as, this is no lie. Only sailors don't usually say lie. Okay? I saw a Facebook posting the other day, it said, alcohol, because no good sea story ever started with, then I sat down and had a salad. So this is a little bit of a sea story that's going to come up. Now, I was supposed to be doing this on the first night, and I apologize for that. It was obviously my fault that the weather was so bad. So you're going to get kind of a different view of what went on. And so I'm going to have to go through some of my slides a little bit more quickly, but you can take from it what you want. And this is a sea story about 2 kids that grew up in Michigan. This is going to be a multimedia presentation. I'm going to point as well as talk. 2 stories that of kids that grew up in Michigan, one in Holland and one in Muskegon. Let's see if I can figure this out now. Okay, so this is my father as a baby. He was born in Chicago. You can see on all of these initial slides, you can see some of the things that were happening in the world. Okay? And this is my grandmother. She was married to a graphic artist out of Grand Rapids. He owned the first real advertising agency in Grand Rapids. Made a lot of money. Very, very rich. Unfortunately, he was so ahead of his time that he was broke 6 months before the Depression hit. Therefore, I don't have any money. And you can see what happened in 1921. This is my grandfather in the middle with his wife. My father's older brother, Chuck, and my father, the baby. And there's my grandfather playing with my father. And shortly after my father was born, they moved back to Holland, Michigan, because my grandfather was told that he needed to leave the hectic pace of advertising. And so he retired at the age of about 48, 49, something of that nature. And he was wealthy enough to do that. At the same time, up here in Muskegon, my mother was born. Now, you're probably wondering, who the heck is that? Looks like a couple of little kids there. But I'll point out that the younger kid there is my mother. And the older person is her older brother, Bernard, who ultimately was killed in a mid-air collision after the war. He flew all through the war, carrier aviation, and was killed after the war. But they grew up in Muskegon. So through 1923-25, they had their normal Michigan upbringing. You can see my father and his older brother up there with some fish. Obviously a pretty successful day. You'll see a lot of fishing things. This is him riding on Chuck's back. And here again, that's them with a whole stringer full of fish that they caught off from the piers down in Holland, and holding some pets. And from 27, 29, he was in the first Cub Scout pack in Holland, Michigan. Ultimately, by the time he graduated from high school, he was an Eagle Scout. It's a pretty typical boyhood story. This is my mother during her high school years. And you can see what's going on in 30 to 33. Depression has hit the landscape. FDR had a landslide victory. Stalin in a second 5-year plan in the USSR. Hitler has already become the chancellor in Germany in 1933. Storm clouds are really on the horizon. 1934-35, Stalin is purging the Communist Party. But again, here's my mother's family, her older brother Bernard, her younger brother Jack, and her high school picture. You can see in 35, Ethiopia invaded Italy. 36, 37, my father graduated from high school. Didn't really have a great plan. His older brother was going to college. The family was broke. They had lost all their money. The house had burned down. They had moved into the servants' quarters, which was a 2-bedroom small house. They were scrambling for every dime they could possibly get, and they could afford to help the older brother go to college, but not my father. But he decided that what he was going to do was he would work and figure out a way to get through college. So he did. He worked at the. I'm getting directions from the back from Frank saying, "Get your mic up a little bit." So he worked at the Heinz pickle factory as I think he called it a torque guy. He would put the last pickle into the pickle jars.
But he got to Hope College. And my mother actually graduated from Muskegon High School, and she also decided to go to Hope College. And her family was also
pretty destitute at that particular time, but they managed to scrape up enough money to help her go. They couldn't provide her with enough to actually pay for it. So she was working a lot of different jobs as well. She was a waitress at the Michelin Lodge. She did a lot of different things, waitressing around, picking up spare change to get through college. But you can see in 38, 39, the Germans entered Austria, invaded Poland, World War II began, and she graduated from Muskegon High School and also went off to Hope College. This is where they met. My father was the editor of the Anchor, which is the newspaper, and my mother was the assistant editor at the Anchor, and they dated for a while. My father also played some football. He played the bench primarily. He was shorter than I am. I'm 5'10". He was 5'6". Weighed about 135 pounds, and he was a guard. I think it's because he never played football before. But he did actually get his letter from Hope College. Never got into a game, but got his letter. The one time he thought he was going to get into a game, they had a big huddle out on the field, and everybody was huddled around one of the guys, and it looked like he was injured and everything. They called him out. He thought he was going into the game, and when he got out to the huddle, they said, "Fritz, take off your pants." So he did. He took his pants off, gave them to the guy that had ripped his pants. He took the other ones off, went back to the bench. But that's him on the second picture down at the Anchor. And my mother, you can hardly see it. I'm sorry for that particular photograph, but she's down on the lower right. And you can see there Fritz Birch, editor-in-chief, Lorraine Timmer is the associate editor. My father had always wanted to go into the Navy. He actually had a lifelong dream of being in the Navy, but he was unable to secure an appointment to the Naval Academy. But when he was in 6th grade, he had to do a vocation paper, and so he did. And this vocation paper's up here. You can come up and look at it after this. But he did a beautiful, beautiful job. I can't believe somebody in 6th grade could do this, but great penmanship, cut out articles and things out of books, pasted them in, had this big thing about why he should be in the Navy, and what a great thing. And the teacher gave him an A. But then she said, "Even though this is a great paper, I hope that you will consider something else for your career. We really need fine young men like you in constructive work." And some of my teachers said that too before I joined the Navy. Only most of them were saying, "We don't want you anywhere near those bombs and stuff." But he found out that you could join the Navy as a reserve in your junior year of college, and you could go on a cruise, and at the end of the cruise, then you could either go back to school, finish up your senior year and graduate, and then be commissioned, go through officer candidate school, or you could go right into officer candidate school and be commissioned. So he did. He joined the reserves. This is him as a seaman. And he joined up and he hitchhiked out to New York, took a cruise on an old battleship down to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And at the end of that cruise, hitchhiked back to Michigan, finished up his year at Hope College, and graduated in absentia because he had to leave a week earlier than the school had. He was the only person in that year to take exams, interestingly enough, because when he went around and asked his profs if he would have to take the exams, they all said yes. And then they canceled the exams for the entire senior class, so they didn't have to take exams. He was the only one that took them. So he was commissioned as an ensign and reported aboard USS Case DD 370 just prior to the war breaking out. Now he picked up USS Case in San Diego, and he picked it up in September. And almost immediately, they were on what they called a play wave, which was coming back from Pearl Harbor to come back so that the sailors could actually see their wives and families. And they'd do that about once every 2 months or so. And he picked them up while they were there in San Diego. Went back to Pearl Harbor, and he started to get settled in onto the ship. This is a picture of the USS Case. You see a beautiful, beautiful destroyer. 3 5-inch guns, secondary batteries of 50 caliber weapons. But this was the ship that he actually started off on. And this is the wardroom. And you can see my father is the third person down the table on the right. At the head of the table is Captain Bedelian, and on the right-hand side of Captain Bedelian is Commodore Craig, both of whom will be interesting here in a second. This character here, right at the front, is Goodhue Livingston, a scion from Massachusetts, a very, very rich character, and he's got an interesting story a little bit. Third guy down on the left is a guy named Johnny Beard. I'll tell you a couple stories about him. And the guy next to him is a guy named Don Ramage, who was ultimately, probably Frank knows this, but he is the brother of Red Ramage, and was one of my father's lifelong friends. And then the XO and Lieutenant Shepard. Okay, so on the 6th of December, the Case had come back a couple of weeks earlier, and they were moored alongside USS Whitney. They were the 4th ship outboard. On the 6th of December, the USS Selfridge came in and was the 5th destroyer outboard of USS Whitney. My father happened to be on board that weekend, primarily because the weekend prior, he had been ashore at the Mona Hotel, and they had some banyan trees there, and there were some tendrils that come down on banyan trees. If you don't know what they are, they're like root systems, and they're like ropes. They look like ropes, and they were on the balcony of the hotel, and one of the guys looked down and said, "Hey, that's Al Shepard down there. He's the gunnery officer on board, lieutenant." At that point, compared to all the ensigns that were up on the balcony, that's a pretty senior officer. So my father thought that it would be kind of funny if he would grab one of those tendrils off the banyan tree and swing between Al Shepard and his date, which he did, in his bathing suit, no shirt, nothing else on, in his bathing suit though. Jumped off on the other side and ran off, and obviously he was recognized. And so when he got back to the ship that weekend, somebody said, "Mr. Shepard wants to see you in his stateroom." So he went up there and knocked on the door, and Al Shepard, welcomed him in and said, "Fritz, I know you're supposed to have leave next weekend, but why don't you stay aboard? I got a few things for you to do." So he was that's the reason he was on board on the day that the Japanese actually attacked. Okay, so what happened at Pearl Harbor? This is a picture of the Japanese lining their planes up, about ready to take them off to attack Pearl Harbor. As you can see, and here's where the pointing comes in, and I lost this thanks to Frank. This is Selfridge, right here, Case, Tucker, Reed, Coiningham, and this is the Whitney. This is where the Battleship Row is. You always hear about Battleship Row down here, okay? And so this is the East Block. And so now you have a little bit of an idea of where people were on the 7th of December. These are the Japanese planes that were used in the attack. This is a Val dive bomber, and this is an actual photo of a Val making a run at Pearl Harbor. This is a Kate torpedo bomber and a Kate that's actually taking off, and I believe this is actually a picture of a Kate taking off for Pearl Harbor. The interesting thing about the Kates is that everybody had said there was no way that you could use torpedoes in Pearl Harbor, too shallow. But the Japanese, as had been brought up earlier, had superb torpedo technology, and they figured out a way so that they did not have to have their torpedoes go down lower than about 25 feet when they dropped them off these airplanes. And so they were able to use their torpedo bombers at Pearl Harbor as well. And then everybody knows about the Zeros. Generally, when you talk about Japanese fighter planes, the Zero is the one that everybody talks about. This happens to be an AGM-1, and this is a carrier landing of one. This is what the Japanese looked at when they were coming in. And this is the actual attack going on. Everybody knows the terrible damage that was being dealt to us. This is Arizona. Got a little story about that here in a second. But that's the Arizona after she had been attacked. This is USS Shaw. This is where my father would usually say, that little tendril right there is his pay record. This is what the strafing did. You can see the bodies in the car. The U.S. aircraft destroyed at the fields, Henderson Field. Not Henderson Field. I can't remember the name of the field. Some survivors in the water. These are divers and one survivor. Anyway, my father's career started off with a bang. This is a picture of my dad in the Holland Evening Sentinel. The Holland Evening Sentinel, at that point, is being Holland, didn't publish a Sunday newspaper. They published a Monday newspaper. So this is actually the 8th of December paper. And they didn't have any pictures. So they called my mother at the anchor and said, you got any pictures of that guy Birch? And she said, yeah, I do. So she sent them a picture. And when the college had heard that the Pearl Harbor had been attacked, some of her friends in her sorority came running up to her after, it was after church. And, well, that doesn't mean anything to anybody because at Hope, in those days, they went to church like all day. Every day. Every day at church, you know, they always had church. But they came up to her and they said, hey, do you know where Pearl Harbor is? Is that where Fritz is? And she said, I don't know. I mean, I know he's out there somewhere. But they went and they looked it up, and yeah, sure enough, that's where he was. Okay, so here's some stories. First off, my father was down in his stateroom as the Japanese attacked. And it was about 7:55. They attacked about 5 minutes before colors. You know, in the Navy, colors, raising the flag goes at 8 o'clock in the morning. Johnny Beard, the guy pointed out in the caption, was up on deck. He was the officer of the deck conducting colors. And suddenly looked out over at Ford Island, and he said, man, there's a big fire out going on over there. So he called up Al Shepard, who was the CDO, because you remember Al Shepard was the guy that wanted my dad on board the ship, and said, hey, shall I call away the landing party to go help them fight the fires? Al Shepard said, yeah. And then he looked over and he said, wait a minute, there's two big fires over there. And about that time, the Tucker, who was the inboard ship from them, actually started to shoot. They had actually gone to general quarters, and they had the first machine gun in operation out of that nest of destroyers. My father heard that, and in order to get to his battle station, when they went to general quarters, he had to come up and traverse the deck and then go down into the engineering spaces because he was an engineer. He was the junior-most engineer on board the ship at that point. They had been in cold iron for the last 2 weeks. Cold iron means that you're not taking any services yourself. In other words, you're not producing your own steam, you don't pump your own flushing water, you don't get any kind of electricity from yourself, you're getting it all from the tender. And so the first thing that happened was as the Whitney started to understand they were under attack, they cut off all of the services with the exception of flushing water. So no electricity, no steam, nothing. So he, as he was running up across the deck, he knew he had to start getting the engineering plan underway. And he was the only engineer aboard besides the enlisted folks. But as he came up out of the deck, he looked up And he said, and this is his words, he said, I could see this valve coming in at me. And he said, and they had the canopy on the aircraft actually back, and so they had the guy that was in there had a big scarf on. He said, it was just like in a movie. He said it was unbelievable. And the Tucker actually shot that plane down, the one that he was looking at, which was kind of interesting. Because out of the, I think it was 27 planes shot down at Pearl Harbor, that nest of destroyers shot down 6 of them between those 5 ships. So anyway, at about the same time that was going on, he saw the Arizona get hit. Okay, so he saw the first bombs hit the Arizona and said, this is serious business. Got down into the engineering place, and he got his troops together, and they were putting the engineering plant together. Now, that's a pretty big job. It took them 2 weeks to tear it down, and now they were trying to put it back together as fast as they could in the dark with no electricity. But they did. They worked real hard. They were getting it all back together, and that was really his remembrance, was getting down into that space in the dark with these guys trying to lift great big heavy valves, 100, 200-pound valves, and try to put them back into the steam stops. These valves had to go up in here, and then they get big torque wrenches on them and try to put them back in. And all the time that they were down there, his troops were singing a song saying, let's do this more often, because it was a real popular song for some reason back in those days. I don't know, but it is. I mean, so they were singing this song while they were trying to put it together. And I guess anything to keep from being too doggone scared while you're getting it. He said the interesting thing was every time a bomb would hit the water, because water is not compressible, it felt like sledgehammers were hitting the side of the ship. So anyway, he started to get the plant back together, and they actually got it back together. And at 12 o'clock, he actually got steam up, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, they were able to get underway. Now the captain was not on board at that particular time when the attack happened. He said he got back at 9:30, and for the rest of his life, he claimed that when he got back at 9:30, remember the attack started about 7:55, he claimed that my dad was still looking like this, waiting for the forward turret of the Arizona to come down. Obviously not true, but it made for a pretty funny story for Captain Badalian. Well, shortly after they got underway, they went out and they had to steam. They were ordered to go out of the harbor, but they got underway at 4 o'clock. And about the time they were getting underway, there was a pastor over the loudspeaker said, "Ensign Birch, report to the bridge." So he went up to the bridge, and Commodore Wyatt Craig was up there, and the Commodore looked at him and said, "Look, son," he said, "they think they sunk a submarine out here in the middle of the harbor out here. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a depth charge, cut the fuse to the minimum amount of 25 feet, take the motor whaleboat out there, roll the depth charge off the motor whaleboat, and so we can make sure that submarine is dead." My dad is like, about the same time, Captain Badalian came on the bridge, and luckily, because I think my dad was probably going to ruin his career forever, but Captain Badalian came on the bridge and said, "Wait a minute, Commodore, no officer of mine is going to do something as stupid as that." He said, "Look, you can order the ship to do anything you want, but you can't tell me how to do it, and you can't tell me who to do it." So they had a big discussion, and they decided that what they would do is they would put my father and the 2 enlisted guys in the motor whaleboat, have him sit on top of where the bubbles were coming up from this submarine that had been depth charged, and he would sit there while the captain took the case down to the far end of the harbor. He'd turn it around, and he would steam towards the motor whaleboat. And we figured that he had a good fix on it. What they were going to do is drop a depth charge. He would blow the horn when he got the fix. They could leave. Then he was going to drop a depth charge. They had a rig where for 200 feet of wire, they could pull pull the plug out of the depth charge, and it would sink, have the hydrostatic fuse go off, blow up the thing. Everybody would be happy, except the guys in the submarine. So that's what they did. He went out there in the motor whaleboat. Motor whaleboat can go about 4 miles an hour, something like that, maybe a little bit more. You know, just chug, 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 chug. So he's out there sitting in the middle of Pearl Harbor. He said nobody had a whole lot to say. He and the two guys weren't real happy about what they were doing. But sure enough, here comes a ship, and they're coming down, steaming down the harbor, and the captain decides he knows where it is. He blows the horn, and my dad gets underway as fast as they can, going about 4 miles an hour. And they came by, and they dropped that depth charge down there, and he said, you know what? He said, it looked like the whole bottom of Pearl Harbor was up above me. He said that thing was just went all the way up. But they got splattered with mud, but the
motor whaleboat made it through, and they got back on board the ship, and out the harbor they went and went off on their work. Well, two weeks later, when they came back into port, this is what they had pulled up out of the harbor. This is actually the sub that they had dropped that depth charge on. And that's why I'm alive. If he'd have been killed out there doing that stupid stuff, I wouldn't be here. Captain Medallion, as I said, he came back to the ship at about 9 o'clock, claimed my dad was still looking seaward, wondered where the Arizona's turret was. Al Shepard, he was the reason why my dad was on board. This is Al Shepard. He turned out to be a pretty big mentor of my father's throughout the war, at least his time on board the Case. Johnny Beard, interesting guy. You know, they talk about how the Navy did so well during the war. Here's what they don't tell you. It wasn't necessarily the professional Navy. It wasn't the guys that were, the career officers. It was the reservists. This is a reserve. Came aboard about the same time that my father did. And Johnny Beard, he was a pretty wild guy. He once chased Al Shepard up onto the bridge with a sword, a dress sword, which I have up here. But he ended up holding, he was on board the Case throughout the war and ended up being the last commanding officer of the war, of the Case. Ensign Goodhue Livingston III came from Old Money. I said from Philadelphia. Actually, it turned out he's from Boston. As I told you, the Shaw had all of the personnel records for the ships on board, and they're trying to get me off the stage. They can't do it. I'm just going to stay up here. All the personnel records went up, and when they went back to the States, the crew had not been paid for 2.5 months, and they didn't get paid for 6 months, for the first 6 months of the war. But he had so much money that the captain let him off the ship a little bit early, and he ran out and he got a bunch of money, put it in a suitcase, and came back, and he lent each one of the sailors $20 and lent each one of the officers, I think, $40. And then they gave him an IOU, and then they paid him back afterwards. So that was the one liberty. They had 12 hours of liberty in Bremerton, and they tore that town up. Don Ramage, I think I told you that about him a little bit. Brother to Medal of Honor winner Red Ramage, famous submariner. He ended up being retired as Commodore. Had the opportunity to meet him. Wonderful man, super kind of a guy. I could probably, sit up here honestly all night talking about this. My wife's giving me this stare now, and I got to obey her. And I do. I probably got 20 more slides up here, but I think that's probably enough for this evening. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Fred. So really thank you. A couple things I want to inform you on. One is Richard Malawi's been conducting a Veterans Document Project here in Muskegon for several years. And his goal, and he's very successful at this, is getting out to document, interview, and really photograph and take note of all World War II veterans. So if there are any veterans that have not been documented and photographed by Richard, he would love to meet with you. Here's his contact information up here. You could contact myself or George Maniates. His work is on display at the LST, as well as the Lakeshore Museum, and as well as here. So he's just done a marvelous job of documenting these veterans. So any World War II veterans that have not been documented and would like to be part of that, Richard would love to speak with you. Now it's time for a student exodus. Before we send them out, they have a project that they're working on. It's called an interview project. The goal is to have students interview veterans or other people who were living during the war and have real good recollections. So what we really like from gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, to help us out with that. If you can make yourselves available next class, before class or after class, to work with some of our students, to just establish a dialogue with them. They'll contact you. They have some formal interview programs that they need to conduct as part of their study and scholarship here. So not tonight after class, but next class before and afterwards, we'd really appreciate if you could make yourself available. We want to really thank Bill Seifert for sponsoring this tonight with Eagle Technologies. We appreciate that. Next week, we've really been looking forward to this. Pearl Harbor is really the starting point for World War II for us as Americans. And while we've enjoyed last week's presentation with Professor Stayhill, just marvelous what we learned this week regarding Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, I think Pearl Harbor in many respects has always been kind of one of the lynch points of this lecture series. Ron Janowski is going to give us a great presentation on that, and he's hiding over there in the back, and we do see you, and we look forward to hearing from you next week. Peggy Henley Maniatis is the Associate Director here at the museum, and she's got a wonderful presentation scheduled for next week called From the Archives. So just to give us a bit of what's happening here at the museum, what we have, and she's put together some really good information. And one thing I would like to remind us, if you have any donations, if you've got artifacts, this is a wonderful home to donate your World War II artifacts. So if you have anything of that you would like to donate to the museum, Peggy is in the back. You'll meet her next week, and she would be glad to take care of that, to catalog and put this on display for this museum, which is growing by leaps and bounds. Other than that, thank you all for coming this week. We'll see you next week at 6 o'clock.